It was a quiet Sunday morning in Selma, Alabama. The air hung heavy with the sweet fragrance of magnolia trees. But there was a sense of unease beneath it all, a silent, almost palpable feeling that something monumental was about to unfold. Josiah Walker, a 17-year-old boy with deep brown eyes and a mischievous smile, sat on the weathered wooden steps of his family's home. He was tying his shoes, taking his time, but his mind was far from the task. The house around him was old, built by his grandfather's hands, and it had stood witness to the struggles of generations before him: slavery, the brutal reality of Jim Crow, and now the deepening scars of segregation that still plagued their lives. Josiah's father, Elijah Walker, stepped out of the house. Dressed in his Sunday suit, Elijah was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. He worked as a janitor at the Selma courthouse, sweeping floors after hours. But in his family's eyes, Elijah was so much more than faith, was a man who believed in something greater than himself. Because of freedom. "Are you ready?" Elijah asked, his voice steady, but his eyes revealing a depth of thought. Josiah stood up and nodded, a determined glint in his eyes. "Yes, sir." It was the day of the marked day they would join the masses in Selma. This wasn't the first time the Walkers had protested, but today, there was something different in the air. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.B., had called for a march to Montgomery, and the entire town was buzzing. Though Josiah didn't fully grasp the enormity of the moment, he could feel the tension rising, the sense of urgency. They were not just walking, they were making history. Elijah and Josiah made their way to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. People were already gathering, their faces a mixture of hope, resolve, and defiance. Josiah's younger sister, Leela, had wanted to come, but their mother, Evelyn, insisted she stay home. The streets were full of people, men, women, and children from all over Alabama. They all knew what they were fighting for: voting rights, respect, and equality. The Walkers joined the growing crowd, their hands locked with others as they approached the bridge. Josiah looked ahead and saw a line of police officers standing at the other end. Their faces hard and unyielding, their batons raised in anticipation. The feeling of unease grew stronger, but Elijah's grip on Josiah's hand tightened. "Stay close," he whispered, and then it began. The crowd surged forward, their voices rising in unison: "We shall overcome." The chant echoed across the bridge, the power of it filling the air. Josiah's heart pounded, but it wasn't fear, no, it was something else. The weight of the moment, the realization of what they were all fighting for, pressed down on him. But then, the sound of boots stomping, the crack of batons hitting flesh, screams. Josiah couldn't see it, but he could hear it all. The police had charged, their violence interrupting the peaceful march. Chaos erupted. Josiah saw men falling, women crying out, children scattering in all directions. Suddenly, someone grabbed him, pulling him back. Before he could even understand what was happening, he was on the ground. His heart raced. He looked up, and there, towering over him, was a police officer's baton raised high. Josiah froze, bracing for the blow. But before it could come, his father stepped in front of him, shielding him from the strike. The crack of the baton hitting Elijah's body rang out, a sound that would haunt Josiah forever. "Papa!" Josiah cried, reaching for his father, but the crowd was scattering, the once unified march torn apart by violence. Josiah looked down at his father, who lay on the ground, barely moving. A scream echoed in the distance, but Josiah's world had narrowed down to the figure of his father. He felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about voting rights anymore. It was about survival. With all his strength, Josiah pulled his father up, and together, they stumbled back toward their home, their steps slow and unsteady. Evelyn and Leela were waiting anxiously, their faces etched with worry. Back in their home, the air was thick with the aftermath of what had happened. Evelyn pressed a wet cloth to Elijah's swollen cheek, her face drawn with concern, but her spirit remained unbroken. Josiah paced the room, his mind racing with questions. "Why do they hate us so much?" he asked, the confusion clear in his voice. Elijah sighed, wincing from the pain. "Because we want what they've had for centuries, Josiah. They're afraid of losing control." Evelyn looked up, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "We can't let them win, Elijah. Not like this." Josiah looked at his father. "So, what do we do?" Elijah's voice was calm but firm. "We keep going. We march again. This time, we march stronger." Josiah's heart sank. After what had just happened, he couldn't imagine going back to that bridge. But in his father's eyes, he saw something different. Determination, a fierce will, and deep down, Josiah knew that this fight was far from over. The days that followed were filled with both anger and resolve. News of the brutality spread quickly, and soon, people from all over the country began arriving in Selma, ministers, students, and even white supporters. They all came to stand side by side with the African American community. One evening, as the Walker family gathered around the kitchen table, there was a knock at the door. Josiah opened it to find Reverend Collins, a tall, imposing man who had been active in the civil rights movement for years. "I came to see how Elijah is doing," Reverend Collins said, stepping inside. Elijah smiled weakly. "I'm all right, Reverend. Just a little sore." Reverend Collins nodded, but his expression was serious. "We need to talk. Dr. King is planning another march. But this time, we'll be ready. We'll have protection, and we'll have the media with us. The world is watching now." Evelyn's eyes filled with concern. "Is it safe, Reverend, after what happened last time?" Reverend Collins let out a long breath. "It's never safe, but change doesn't come without sacrifice." Josiah, who had been listening quietly, stood up. "I'll go. I want to be part of it." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him. Elijah's eyes were filled with pride, but also concern. "Are you sure, son?" Josiah nodded firmly. "I'm sure. This fight is bigger than us. It's for Leela, it's for Mama, it's for everyone who's too scared to stand up." Reverend Collins smiled. "Then it's settled. We march in 3 days." The day of the second march arrived quickly. This time, the crowd was even larger, stretching far beyond the Edmund Pettus Bridge. People from every corner of the country stood in solidarity. The police were there too, but so were the cameras. Josiah could feel the difference in the air. The tension was still there, but now, there was hope. Elijah, still recovering from his injuries, stood at the back with Evelyn and Leela, while Josiah joined the front lines with Reverend Collins. As they approached the bridge, the chant of "We shall overcome" filled the air once again. But this time, there was power behind it. Josiah's heart raced as the line of police officers came into view. He could see their physicality unyielding. But they wouldn't back down. As they approached the bridge, the crowd stopped just before the police line. Josiah's breath caught in his throat as they waited. Then, out of nowhere, a voice rang out from the police line, "Stand down." It was a voice no one had expected. Captain Turner, a police officer with a deep scar across his forehead, stepped forward. "I fought in the war," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I fought for freedom, and I'll be damned if I stand here and stop these people from getting what's rightfully theirs." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the other officers exchanged uncertain glances. Slowly, one by one, the officers lowered their batons. Captain Turner stepped aside, and the marchers moved forward. As Josiah crossed the bridge, he looked back at his father. Elijah stood tall, his face filled with pride. For the first time, Josiah felt the full weight of what they had just accomplished. They had won, not just the right to march, but the right to be heard, to be seen. And though the fight for justice was far from over, Josiah knew one thing for certain: they had made history.